Hi, my name is Max Gagliardi, and this is the Talk Energy Podcast. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app. And while you're at it, maybe give me a like, a share, do what you can to help the cause. I'd really appreciate it. This episode's guest is Nick Volkmer, the Vice President of ESG and Renewables at Enverus. Nick has a background in equities research, and he's spent his career analyzing energy companies. I wanted to have Nick on because I feel like the acronym ESG means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and so I wanted to talk to somebody who studies it as a professional. This episode is filled with discussions of what it actually means for when companies have environmental, social, and governance policies within their organization. We talk about what policies these companies are pursuing and whether or not it's actually making a difference. And lastly, we talk about the implications of the ESG movement and how it's going to affect the future of the oil and gas industry. Hope you enjoy the show. Well, Nick, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Max, for having me.
Want to hear about your background. Excited to hear about it. I know you've probably been busy with all the ESG stuff going on. I know that's your focus now, but before we go into that, where are you at? Where are you at right now?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely excited to be here. So, I started in the industry about 6 years ago, and it's been pretty fun since then. So now I focus mainly on ESG and kind of like understanding the overall impacts of ESG in the market. But it really started out working for like an investment research firm. We were ITG at the time, and doing a lot of technical analysis for the oil and gas industry, and really trying to bring that to the financial level and help people make investments that way. And I don't know if you know the history of ITG to RSEG to Enverus, but it's been a pretty fun ride along the way. But essentially, we started off working really closely with investors, and then realized that, hey, we're doing a lot of great technical analysis. And like one thing that's always exciting about the oil and gas industry is just the sheer amount of data that's available. And
Sure.
Our analysts were experts in combing through that data, taking a really rigorous approach to it, and then ultimately putting crafting some story that investors could get behind. So we started putting out our own data after we got carved out of ITG and rebranded as RS Energy Group, and built our own software platform where you could do a lot of really high-powered data analytics, spacing analysis, understanding remaining inventory for companies, understanding kind of like our own view of companies' type curves and PDP profiles and things like that. So worked there for a number of years, and I ran the Gulf Coast research arm in that area, so really focused on Eagle Ford and Haynesville developments. But tasked with looking at things from really trying to understand what technology companies were applying in the field, how things were changing, where might investors need to really understand the detailed work that was happening in the field when trying to either make like a private equity investment or just with like a credit investment, or even just within the overall equity market. And really trying to become experts in that area. And then it was about 2019 where we started fielding a lot of ESG related questions. So investors started turning their attention to like, hey, we understand the assets, we understand the finances pretty well of these companies. One thing we don't really understand that well is what are these companies' emissions profiles like? What are their, how many, that's when the different scopes of emission really started hitting the forefront of investors' minds. So like from a direct emission standpoint, like, how energy intensive are these barrels of oil that are being produced? Who's flaring more gas per barrel of oil produced? What's the water usage rates for these companies? And really trying to how are these companies governed, and really asking hard questions that fit this new ESG narrative. And that's where we,
that's awesome.
Start expanding into that.
Yeah. So a couple of things, man. There's a bunch of questions I have for you there about that old role, but real quick, when I asked where you were at, I was kind of wondering, like, physically, where are you at right now? You gave a great background. You get, you're not close to me. We're in very different places. So
yeah, no, it's
you're kind of across the world, which is cool.
Yeah, I'm based out of Sydney, Australia here. So been here for almost a couple of years, about a year and a half. Which has been nice. Yeah, I'm Canadian by background, so being able to see the sun year round is pretty eye opening.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask where you're from. That's interesting that you're in Australia. It's cool. I've not done a pod with anyone in Australia, but it's just wild, the technology that we have to be able to connect from these far distances away. It's pretty sweet. I always think it's fun. I've not done many even international ones. You're like the second or third one, so it's cool. But
that's good.
But no, I mean, I want to unpack some of the stuff you laid out. And so in the research role, the things you did and the drill downs that you did, kind of looking at these companies and getting into the data and how you aggregated that data. But one real quick thing on your background, I guess you're a CFA charter holder, which I have a lot of respect for because I did take the first test and passed it. I did not pass the second test. It was a very difficult exam. I did it in like my mid-20s. And I actually took the second one twice. I'm not embarrassed to say it. I've said it publicly and didn't pass it either time. And I was just like working full time. I was at Chesapeake at the time.
Okay.
And I was working like long hours and didn't even really have a role in research or finance. I just was kind of, I guess, masochistically wanted to do it for some reason. But for people that have it, I have a lot of respect because that's a difficult exam to go through, and you really have to know your stuff. I mean, it's not a joke. Like those things aren't easy. So just wanted to tell you respect on that. What was the drive there? Did you, just because of being in that research role and the finance role, that was something you wanted to do, or what pushed you to want to do that?
Yeah, so my background's actually in engineering. So like that's what I took a dual degree chemical engineering chemistry program at university, and then was thrown into the role of finance right away, and didn't have a huge background, didn't have a lot of experience there. So it was a way for me to get up the curve, to kind of talk to the people and our clients that we were talking to. And it was actually, like, to be honest with you, there was a good camaraderie about it too. Because like one thing I think is interesting with the CFA is it's very individual. Like there's no, you just write these tests. You got to study on your own. But at RS Energy at the time, there's a few of us taking it, so it was pretty fun to we were working pretty hard. We were working long 60-hour weeks just at work, and then all kind of pooling together on the weekends and getting through it. So it was definitely a lot of work, but I think it was a good way to learn, get a pretty in-depth knowledge on the overall financial markets.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in the CFA. I mean, in terms of, I think they make the test too hard. I'm a little bitter, but I thought the actual material was really good. And I was a business kind of background, but I wasn't like finance or investment finance specific. So I learned a lot, mainly how to use a reverse Polish calculator really good, because that's the one that I went with. What's that one called? Did you use that or the other kind? Which one did you? They give you the two options.
Yeah, well, I didn't use that.
You know what I'm talking about? I forgot the number.
I can't remember what it was called now. It's been a few years.
Yeah, I can't remember either. It's been a few years, but I learned how to do the reverse Polish, and that's for some reason I felt like that was easier to do all that math with. Yeah, but it's a cool thing to have that you got. And so I think, and that obviously is going to help with, tearing down some of these companies and looking at it and digging into their financials. And I thought a lot of the skills that were taught in that program could be really good for the research side. Obviously, a lot of guys in your field have it. And so when you did some of this research at your, prior to getting into the ESG stuff, how'd you get a lot of that data? How'd you guys aggregate the data? I mean, when you went in to go dig into these companies, I mean, half the battle is probably just getting good quality data and then figuring out how to manipulate it. So what would you do?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's one thing that's pretty unique with the oil and gas industry is just the sheer amount of high quality public data that's available. There's a lot of different reporting requirements that companies have to go through. And we we'd really started the research business back in 1998. And we had a ton of experience just understanding Texas RRC data at its heart and really understanding the reporting processes that companies have to go through. And it was, when I got there back in 2015, you should have seen just the sheer amount of these massive Excel models that we all had going to pull in this data and manipulate it. And I think one of the successful pieces of RS Energy Group was really trying to pull in, like we hired a chief technology officer pretty early on in that life cycle, and we were early on in pulling down or building a pretty comprehensive data science team and software team, and ultimately it's I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's like thousands of different data locations that we pull in today, and that could be everything from federal data, from company specific data, from state specific data. It's there's the amount of data you can gain from satellites now is expanding pretty considerably, and there's a lot of stuff that's available. But to your point, it's really hard to kind of distill that down and make it something actionable and useful. And that's something that that we were pretty good experts in. And I think too, a part of it's about being multidisciplinary about it, right? So you can kind of see that with my background, like a little engineering, a little finance. But the team that I worked for covering the Gulf Coast, like we had a ton of really smart geologists, we had petroleum technologists, we had other just pure financial majors, other like pure engineering majors, and it was really data scientists, and it was about bringing a lot of different expertise together to try to think through these problems.
That's awesome. Was it like hard with comparing data from one company to another company, and somebody like, the thing I've always found difficult with oil and gas and is just the accounting systems in these companies and the way someone wants to classify. This guy takes, like for example, when we were at Chesapeake, they would, for some reason, you'd see all these things in accounting and you're like, why are we doing it this way? And it was, we're taking the fuel and we're turning the fuel charges into a monetary charge because production gets, their bonuses are based off barrels and MCF flowing. And so if there's a fuel charge in the field, it doesn't show as much production. So they convert it to an MCF like fee and they show it that way in our differentials. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. It's like, just because they want to show a higher production number. And then if you try to use that data to then, do other things with it, it's like, well, wait a second. Is this apples to apples, especially when you're comparing like company to company? So I can just imagine your guys' job of just trying to understand what I'm looking at. And is it really even, how do you figure out whether it's real or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's one of the inherent challenges of relying solely on company disclosure, is that everyone does things a little bit way. Everyone interprets some of the rules and regulations a little bit different. What's nice about state or federal data is that it levels the playing field a lot more, and there's a lot more consistencies to the way that the data gets reported. And that's what we specialize at, is like, we'll look at what companies say, but we'll try to do as much stuff independently too, right? Like I used to hand draw, I think it was 2,500 individual type curves in the Eagleford to really understand the production profiles of the whole play. And we did that independently. And then at the end, we'd benchmark, okay, like what's Chesapeake or saying in their investor presentation, and like what are the type curves that they're giving to the street, and how do our kind of independently calculated type curves compare to that? And I think that's where we tend to have an edge, is trying to take that, the extra steps of doing some of the hard work ourselves and then comparing that to company disclosure. And I think that's going to transition well to ESG, because that's one of the big challenges with ESG is the lack of consistency in data, just given that there's a lot less, there's like, yes, there's different ways that companies could look through the standards for accounting, but there's still like, GAAP accounting standard boards that companies have to adhere to, where ESG, it's a little bit all over the place. And I think that's one of the things the market's struggling with right now.
Yeah. Right. It's kind of like, what are the metrics going to be? At the end of the day, you've got the different things that they look at these companies. And that's what I want to kind of dig into next, which is like, what is green? What is ESG? It just seems like such an opaque, thing that we're dealing with around how do you measure this stuff? I see a lot of things around reporting standards and how things are, looked at from company to company, and then within the industry, and, and then from like, for example, from oil and gas to the renewables side, and how are they, there are different standards over here than over here. And so what are some of the metrics, if you can share them, that you feel like are key, or that the industry is keying in on, that you guys are focusing on when you're kind of looking to grade or to rank companies around the ESG stuff? Or is that something that you look at?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that really what fascinates me with the whole ESG world today is like I really feel like I've seen it come from the capital market side of the equation here, where, like I said, back in 2019 was really when investors were turning their attention to this. And it's been really interesting to see how that's evolved over time. And the way that, like, there's, I'm sure we'll get into it in kind of the details of our view on how ESG's coming out into the market. But there's a lot of different ways that investors are kind of bringing that into their workflow, and that's going to dictate what metrics are important to them. But it's interesting to see the ideas behind why they actually think that it's worthwhile. Because for the longest time it was finances and assets, like those are the two things we're going to consider. And I think that's there's a lot of merit to that. And what's interesting from the ESG side is it's almost a way to model in the resiliency of some of these companies, where there's you could take like an environmental approach to it and things like that. But if you understand which companies have already put in the infrastructure to alleviate any type of flaring, then you don't have to worry about what Texas does, or like if they're going to change any of the flaring regulations, right? It's not going to be a monetary penalty down the road. And same with emissions. Like if you already have really good methane leak detections and you have relatively low emissions per barrel produced, then there's not a lot of monetary consequences there's not a lot of risk of some type of regulation changing that impacting your business. And likewise, if you could understand what's driving management's decisions, and really like the way to look at that we look at governance is understanding what's incentivizing management teams. Like, what are they going to get paid for? That's typically what they're going to focus on. Then you could understand how these different companies are going to react. And, like when oil hits $65 or in different situations like that. So overall, though, the numbers that are at the forefront of investors' minds are the ones that we track the closest. On the environmental side, it's going to be everything around emissions. So how many direct emissions or scope 1 emissions does a company produce per barrel, or either BOE or per barrel of oil produced, that we look at in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per BOE. So either on a total basis, or if you just strip out the carbon dioxide and just focus on the methane, because I think that one there tends to get a little bit of a louder voice in the market. Those are right. That's the big one. But then also flaring rates are huge. Water usage rates, like what percentage of water are companies either using in like certain areas, or like what percent are they recycling? On the social side, a lot of it is, what are they doing in the areas they operate in? What's the diversity profile of their company looking like, which is a good way to measure the diversity of thought at a company. And then, as I mentioned, on the governance side, it's like, can you dig through the 200-page proxy statements that these companies put out and understand, what's management getting paid to do, and what's going to be driving some of their decisions. And you could find some pretty fascinating things, and you could actually get a pretty good edge on the positioning of these companies, which I found pretty interesting.
Does it matter where the emissions end up falling out? Like if it ends up being one of these things where, like, for example, how far do you trace it, right? Because do you go through just their facilities? Do you take it to the midstream facilities? Do you take it all the way to the burner tip, right? Like if the gas is getting liquefied and put on a ship, a tank or a ship, does it go? Do you track it all the way to where the end users are? And the reason why I ask that is because a lot of it, the emissions are kind of like who's holding the bag, right? Like if you build all your own facilities and you own all your own midstream and you own your own processing plant and you own your own transmission line, well, then you're going to show a heck of a lot more emissions than if you sub all that out and you literally just have a line that goes to a sales point and you release, and none of the air permits are in your name and custody goes to the other guy, and your reportable emissions are much less than this guy that's vertically integrated. And so how do you, where's the cutoff point for this stuff? And do guys hide it, and is it hard to measure it depending on where air permits are in their name and how integrated they are? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, right? Is like it's how to properly account for these things. And like a good example of that is looking at the Canadian versus U.S. companies' emissions profiles. And that was something we got asked a ton of questions on, because I think that in Canada, where there's already a pretty aggressive carbon tax on, there's very strict flaring regulations throughout most of the provinces. People assume that the emissions profile is going to be relatively low compared to some of the areas in the U.S. But when you look at companies, they actually screen on the high end, and it's because of that vertical integration question, where Canadian companies more frequently own their processing facilities, their transmission lines. Like they own a lot more of the infrastructure compared to U.S. companies. And I think that that's where we could come in and help our clients out, is understand that dynamic, because what you find in ESG is it's really hard to make an informed decision off face value. Like you could go to company disclosure, you could look at their sustainability reports, you could look at their, presentation material. And, like I've been pretty impressed with the level of disclosure that companies are giving these days. But you need to really put that thought in to figure out who's comparable. And, some of the data that we get and we show in our platform, like we have we've added in an ESG module to our platform, is looking at that breakdown where we've categorized the emissions based off is it from the upstream segment, is it on the midstream segment, is it on the processing segment? So if you're a company that's fully integrated, I could look at the three groups of emissions that you have, and then only compare your upstream emissions to other companies that only have upstream ownership. So and that's the fun thing about like some of this analysis, right? Is it's not about just taking one data source or things from face value. It's about trying to piece the puzzle together to really understand what's happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like things like this, you look at things like Scope 1. And you say, okay, well, there's different things you can do. Like, for example, compression's a big one, that there's a lot there. And you've seen guys moving kind of towards electric compression. And that obviously reduces Scope 1. But, I've heard investors, we have a infrastructure, commitment that we've raised to look at infrastructure projects. And we looked at different things that have an ESG slant where there's like an electrification aspect to it. And then maybe an investor will say, well, yeah, one of these electric compressors is the equivalent of 700 Teslas in terms of CO2, tons a year that it reduces, but it's still used to pump oil out of the ground. So it's dirty. That's greenwashing. And you're like, yeah, but I mean, it's the equivalent of 700 Teslas. And by the way, that oil is going to get pumped either way. So, I mean, with the people and I don't know who your clientele are, but is there a more of a focus now? We're hearing the term greenwashing come up, where it's like oil and gas companies are trying to be cleaner and do things better, but are investors, how detailed are they getting into these things that companies are doing? Are they, calling them out? Or so what are your thoughts around any of that stuff?
Yeah. So I think when you look at the industry as a whole, I think that there's a lot of within oil and gas, you're going to have a lot of opinions that people already have baked in when looking at it. And I think we saw that in the divestment movement too. Like there's a lot of funds that are just like, hey, oil's dirty, we're just going to move away from it. And I don't think you're ever really going to get away from those from that ideology. What I think we've seen that's really constructive is companies that are investors and firms that are like, hey, we know oil is going to be part of the energy mix for a long time here. It's foolish to think otherwise. And we know that there's different ways to develop oil and gas. So what we're going to do is, yes, we have to put 10% of our funds into oil and gas. We're going to make sure that we back the right horses in that race. And so, we talk to investors every day. We talk to operators every day. I think that I've been pretty surprised and blown away by just like the level of attention ESG is getting as a whole on the industry. And I see real concrete solutions that operators are doing to put in place. Like, people at oil and gas companies, like they care about the environment and they want to, there's a lot of net benefits too from doing some of these things. Like if you could capture your gas and sell it, then there's a good monetary benefit there. If you're, if you have a methane leak on your pipe, like no one wants that. You want to be able to fix that and sell more of your gas. I think that you like within oil and gas, you're going to hear some of that talk. I thought there was going to be a lot more. Like when I shifted gears here in 2019 and started doing ESG, I thought that there was going to be a lot more from both sides, like kind of push back on it being greenwashing, and then also on the operator side, potentially, it's like not kind of like brushing ESG to the side. And I've been really surprised by how little that's happened on both ends. And, operators are taking this seriously, and investors are being pretty rational about it. Like, yes, you'll have some that aren't, but as a whole, I think that, to your point, if you're electrifying some of your operations, then it's with respect to your own operations. And I think that's getting rewarded.
Yeah, that's good. What about like some of these projects that are getting announced? Like, some of this stuff, like I think the emissions, like the leak detections and, for example, I think the electrification stuff, there's a lot of things guys are doing and that I think are real impactful that actually make a difference. And that's important. And I think if you ask a lot of oil and gas people, they will say that, yes, I would consider myself somebody that cares about the environment. And then I'll have people like laugh and be like, well, you work in, oil and gas. Like, how could you say that? And it's like, because I do care about the environment. Like, I don't think anyone's out here being like, I don't care about the environment. Exactly. That's why I'm doing oil and gas, right? Like people care. And so, but then you see some of this other stuff that's like a little more, I don't want to say gimmicky, but it's kind of like, I don't know. There are some projects that you see announced, and do you see some things with some operators that are kind of just to hit the headlines and just to get that blurb in their quarterlies where they talk to the analysts? Or is that not as, I think the cynical part of you is kind of like, hey, I saw this announcement that person did. Like, how real is that? Are investors asking those types of questions? Like, is this thing real, or is this just like a gimmick?
Yeah. Like, I think that's that's been a lot of our business, right? Like, we take an unbiased view to the analysis that we do. And, we try to, we look at ourselves as trying to cut through the smoke. And inevitably, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, like, there'll be some of that happening. And, you could go back to some of the type curves that were put out by the industry 3 to 5 years ago, and they look pretty rosy today relative to what we actually saw in the field. So I think that it's a natural part of any business. Like, you can see that in a lot of, like, if you think about some of the rosy forecasts on some of these SPAC deals too, like, there's a lot of, in the market, there's always a pretty optimistic viewpoint. And that's where, we really try to dig in and take that unbiased view. Cause like, some of them work out really well. Some of them, maybe not so much. And, what we want to do and what I want to do is be able to, not only, cause like, one of the things with ESG that you'll find is you could tend to get high level and almost a little fluffy with it, where we come at it, and what I try to do is really show, like, if you look at any of the reports that we publish, we're very transparent about the actual quantitative metrics that we're using. And then it could be like, yes, this company, put in, like electrified some of their operations or something like that to get the headline. But then I could show you that they're still flaring 15% of their gas, and they're still, even though they, like, some parts might be electrified, it doesn't, it's still, it doesn't shift their ranking, where other companies will have electrified their operations because they've already built out the infrastructure to limit their flaring. They already have some of the lowest methane emissions that they've it's kind of like the next logical step in the progression of moving towards zero emission barrels. So I think that naturally you'll see some of that stuff, but that's where we come in, and that's where we try to help people out, is pick out what's real and what's wrong.
Yeah. For sure. You know what I always wonder, and I don't know that anybody's tracking this, but I'm curious if I don't know that you guys are looking into this at all, but some of these things that are like at the policy level, and I don't want to get political, but look at like what California, some of the regulations that they've done, or like, for example, the Keystone Pipeline. Is there any like quantifying kind of the impacts of some of these things? Like, for example, if we were to shut down Keystone, how many, barrels go on rail, and what does that mean from an emission standpoint? Or if California bans fracking, how many additional barrels do they have to import, and what does that mean? Or did some of these other things, like, is that anything you guys look at in that realm at all? Or is it all private companies? Those are just things that I have a curiosity about, because I'm all about, doing what's right for the environment and making the policy decisions that are best. But then sometimes I just wonder, because I see this stuff and I'm like, is that really cleaner? And I think there's good arguments that say it's not. There's other arguments that say, well, that lowers the useful life of those reserves because the differentials are worse now. And so that's the goal. In 20 years, that field will be less productive. But does anybody track that stuff? I don't know if you guys look at that, but like, that's just a curious thing that in my mind, not just what companies are doing, but what policies that are happening, and are they really cleaner? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that is a constant debate, and like that, I wouldn't say it's something that we specialize in. Like what we focus things on is really from not just like a private company level, but publics as well. Like we'll interpret policies as they get shifted, but we try to steer a little bit clear of having, we try to be as apolitical as possible and steer clear of getting into some of those debates. Like what we'll look at is the impact of the, Keystone gets banned. We'll look at the impact of, what's that going to do to, Canadian oil sands producers' operating margins and things like that, and kind of look at the consequences of it. That stuff though, like, there'll be some natural trade-offs with it. And I think that like that's a big debate in Canada with LNG. Like LNG facilities have been notoriously difficult to build throughout Canada, and because of their environmental impact, and the industry's narrative there is that it's a way to lower the world's dependence on coal too. So there's like a huge net emissions benefit when you actually look at the sum of the parts. But if you just look at the sum to Canada, it could have it could be seen as a net negative. It could be seen as a net negative. So I think that there's a lot of trade-offs. It's the same. You'll see it in the renewable versus hydrocarbon debate too. Like the land use for renewables is higher than hydrocarbons, but has lower emissions. So it's like there's a trade-off to a lot of these things, and I think it's about having a sensible view. And to do that, you have to, you could, like, we haven't done it yet, but you could definitely quantify the amount, like the emissions trade-off with some of these different solutions.
Seems like someone would be interested in tracking it, right? I mean, it seems like, and it also seems it would be available data, because you could probably, you guys are probably smart enough on it to say, if these barrels aren't going on this pipe, well, they're going on these trucks, and that company's public. Yeah, on these rails or these trucks, and they're getting, and so, and we can tell what their emissions are because we track that. And so this is the trade-off here. I just don't ever hear any of that. You never hear anybody really talk. You hear people saying a lot of arm waving around, this is dirtier, or this, if you shut this down, or if you ban this, but like, I just don't ever see any, it would be really interesting to me whether, not even to say one's right or one's wrong, just to have that kind of data, to be like, whenever things are getting talked about in the policy level, to be like, hey, well, here's some numbers that kind of back up these different decisions. And, I don't know that anyone cares to track that stuff, but I'm curious about it. I don't know. It seems like it should be out there, I would think, but who knows? I don't know that it's widely looked at. It's just kind of things happen and then we move on. But it's interesting. What about it's interesting. I try to stay pretty apolitical on this show too, but these are the questions that I have to ask because I'm curious about them. But the other thing is some of these more mega projects, like the carbon capture type stuff. I don't know your views on some of the larger scale, and I don't know how much you look at carbon capture. I've done a little bit of research on it and have looked into it because I kind of have a midstream background. Is that something you guys look at, some of these types of projects, and what's the realistic feasibility, if you have an opinion on it, on timelines for these things that are kind of more these macro, big picture, infrastructure projects that could reduce CO2, or do you guys track any of that?
Yeah, I would say we track that stuff. We've been looking at EOR and different carbon capture and storage mechanisms for a few years here, and I think it depends on the framework you're looking at things from. Like in my view, when you look at the goals that different countries and different areas or different companies have for decarbonizing, some of their like the amount of net zero goals and a lot of the different goals out there, I think that it's hard to argue that you can't really hit those goals without having a pretty significant component of carbon capture and storage. And I think that I think that there's a lot of reason to believe that it's that there's a pretty solid path forward for carbon capture and storage. And like what we look at it from, and I think some of the interesting questions that I've had is, okay, like if you're an investor with some with oil and gas exposure, what paths do you have to get net long carbon, right? So is there a way that you could right. benefit from a potential future where carbon costs or the price of carbon appreciates? And a lot of our clients are, ourselves included, are trying to see, okay, like what does that mean from a carbon capture and storage model? Because I think that there's technical challenges with it. There's like costs associated with it, of course, but if you start having an explicit cost on carbon, then it's going to start green lighting a lot more of these projects. And I think that there's a strong path forward there. And then you look at the expertise that, like the midstream players have, and that that some of these EOR specialists have in the market. And I think that, there's I think it's like the US is pretty well set up to be leaders in carbon capture and storage. Like, if you're turning on a natural gas plant today, if you're turning on, I guess there's not a lot of coal plants turning on today, but there's, it's unrealistic to think that these plants are going to shut down in the near term here. And it's much more realistic, in my opinion, to start thinking about a broader carbon capture and storage infrastructure. So to the extent that I'd say that's one of the things that's emerging is on the storage side. And then the other thing that we're looking a lot more into is on the offset side, just on the right. Like when you look at markets that are pretty opaque, like carbon capture, carbon offset markets, I don't think are really well understood in North America, because they're larger. They're essentially all voluntary markets here, but you're seeing a lot of private companies you're seeing a lot of companies starting to tap into those markets, and I think that that's going to cause a lot more interest from the credibility of some of these offsetting projects, the amount that are, like the amount of offset projects that are available, and how carbon capture and storage could play into those markets.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to be something that evolves, because, if you really look at it, it's going to be difficult to meet the goals that we want to meet from a climate perspective, to meet these goals that have been put out there. Just through renewables, there's certainly going to be a ramp up in time it takes to switch to these things. And if you look at natural gas, it's obviously, cleaner relative to coal and abundant. And then if you, couple some of these things with carbon capture, you can really make headway into it. Then you've also got all these other guys on the people that are the users of these hydrocarbons, like the airline companies and, the Amazons of the world, making a lot of claims about net zero and saying in 5 years and all these things. And it's like, well, then you're going to have to start doing quite a bit of offsets, and that market's going to have to mature. It's an interesting thing to me, because again, getting back to being a midstream guy, if there's an opportunity to get out there and to do projects and to look at things, I certainly want to be smart on it, but it just feels like it's just not there yet. And I can't, if I had a guess, I'd say 5 years, but does that seem too long, too short? I don't know, I'm asking you to predict the future, but it seems like that market's going to have to mature.
Yeah. Like I'd say it's going to be driven by the time. Like, I think it's safe to say that 10 to 15 years from now, the price of carbon is going to be higher than it is today. And I think that sure. it's going to be dependent on that trajectory right now. Like, we put out a report recently, like kind of analyzing the carbon markets, and to offset a ton of emissions in the U.S. Because it's all voluntary, right? It's not a heavily it's not regulated or anything like that. You could buy offsets right now for like $2 to $7 a ton, so it's super cheap to do that. Yeah. The European market right now, it hit like 40 or 50 euros a ton. So there's like a huge, there's obviously very big structural reasons, and I'm not going to say there's like a carbon tax or anything like that that's going on in the industry anytime soon. But I think that, it's like once you get, if that the explicit price increases, then you could start to see a market open up sooner rather than later. Definitely, from a full market standpoint, 5 years sounds about right. But like I wouldn't like I definitely think we're starting to see some other projects get built sooner than that. And it's even from an E&P standpoint, I think it's been interesting to see the attention that some of these EOR specialists that essentially, there's ways to produce oil using very like net negative scope 1 emissions, but really close to net negative scope 3 emissions through CO2 floods. And that's something that I think that is getting explored a lot more seriously now than it has been since I've started working in this industry.
Yeah, for sure. We'll see. It's gonna have to get there, I think, to meet some of these goals. And there's no kind of magic bullet around some of these things that we need hydrocarbons for, especially on the power gen side. There's just only so much time you can replace, and then there's still baseload demand, and it's gonna. And then with all the people making the claims that they're going to be net zero, when you're hearing like airlines and stuff say that, it's like, well, then how's that going to work? That's like a grocery store saying they're going to be net zero food. It's like, well, you better figure some way to offset your, you know what I mean? That's just like what you guys do is you guys burn a lot of jet fuel. So I think it's going to have to get there, I guess is what my point is. If these claims that people are making are true.
Exactly. So that's the thing. You're either betting that these claims are just going to go away, right? And companies are going to realize that it's unfeasible, or you're betting on the fact that you're going to see an appreciating offset market, because to fit those needs, you're going to have to see that.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Let's get back to the E&P companies and I guess midstream companies as well. And I want to talk a little bit about midstream and some of the things, 'cause that's my background. I've worked for E&Ps most of my career, but I've been doing a lot of midstream kind of functions and marketing, energy market stuff in my career. So talk about both, but these executives at these companies, you touched on it earlier about their behaviors are shaped, how they're incentivized. Do you think those incentive programs, I'm sure they're already there around ESG. How much more of that do you see coming down the pipe in terms of what are these guys really going to be held to? And is that really how we're going to change behavior, is putting these metrics on these companies and at the C-suite level and making this? I know they've done it with safety in the past. And I think the safety record's gotten a lot better, but what are they doing today and how do you see that evolve?
Yeah, safety's a good point. We put out a report last year looking at Permian emissions, and the single most effective thing that companies did to lower their emissions was start to incentivize their employees. So it might not have just sat at the executive level, but a lot of companies now are doing like some type of like bonus program or something like that for like in-field solutions to reducing emissions. And there was like 4 or 5 companies that had done that, and every one of them saw dramatic drops in their overall emissions. So yes, I think that a good way to incentivize people within our industry is to pay them. And so I think that that's going to work. When you look at it from a total executive compensation level, there's some companies where it's veering on like 20% of short-term incentive, but it's not a huge makeup of their overall incentive. Wow. But when you think about like short-term relative to like their overall long-term and base salary, it's not necessarily that massive, but it's like there are real targets being put on by these companies, and beyond what I think I see in the market, like what I hear speaking to clients, it's the amount of focus from the different executive teams and boards of directors that we talk to is like on reducing emissions and showing that they're leaders in this space is pretty high. So I think that I've noticed like a pretty big shift in the conversations I've had over the last year or two with companies putting, I think fairly like they're putting in good targets in place, and they're going to hit those targets, if not exceed them. Like I was talking to one executive, and when we first started talking about ESG, and he was like, this is just the next engineering challenge. Like we had like safety as a good example, but I think spacing was a big question mark kind of in like the 2016, 2017 timeframe, even 2018. It kind of started off with exploration. So where are these plays, where can we actually produce unconventional wells? And then there was a point where everything looked like it was core, and then you had to figure out which pockets of the plays are actually going to be economic in the long run. It transitioned to understanding completion designs, and you saw like massive ramp ups and like proppant intensity and fluid intensity in the wells that were being drilled. And now we're seeing it as a lot of this stuff, a lot of the plays are in full development mode now. Now let's make sure that we're kind of understanding and limiting the ESG profile of our companies. So you see it from a compensation standpoint, and then you also see it from an executive direction standpoint. And I think where this gets interesting is when you is if there's sight into decommoditizing the oil and gas that gets produced. And there's a few organizations out there now that are putting on their stamp to say that this is like responsible natural gas or responsibly sourced gas or like low emission oil. And I think that we continue to see that market increase too. So it's not only can it be good PR to be a good ranking ESG company, but now there's also a monetary incentive too, where you could get a slightly higher price for the for the natural gas or oil you produce if you could prove that it's being developed in a sustainable way.
Yeah, I wonder how that's going to blow over with some groups. I think that that's a cool idea, and I think it's good. I think best practices in anything from an ESG or environmental standpoint is a good thing. I don't know that many people would argue with that, but I just don't know that like environmentalist groups are really going to care too much if it's sustainably sourced hydrocarbons. Maybe they will. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they'll say, hey, look, that's good that you're doing that better, but I don't know.
No,
they may just look at that and say, I don't know. It's still oil. It's still gas. What about like rankings for these companies? I'm sure they're out there. Is that something I haven't seen them, to be honest. Are these guys going to start getting put like under the hot seat and say, you're the, worst of the super majors and are there rankings? Maybe I'm just ignorant. Yeah. I'm sure they're out there, and then how more popular is that going to get? And is that going to be one of these things that these guys are really fighting to make sure that they're, at where they're at in the rankings?
Yeah, like that's one of the things that we offer is rankings. So we take in the data that we have, and we rank companies on break evens. We rank them on their oil recoveries per foot, and now we're ranking them on their ESG characteristics. And when we go about it, we're super transparent. We're like, hey, like these are the exact data points we're using to rank you. I could show you exactly where each of these data points came from. And this is the equation that we're using to get to the rank. And then, we're kind of looking at the North American producers on one chart to see where they fall. And, this allows us to be explicit about what's driving our scores, and it's about showing what's actually differentiating a good operator from a bad operator. Those are we're unbiased. Like we don't have any we've been following this industry for decades now. We don't own any assets. We don't drill any wells. Like we don't take positions in the securities of these companies either. So we are unbiased. So that's what a lot of people value from our opinion, and our investor, the institutional clients we work with, they always like getting an unbiased view. That if you put out a report where you say a company's ESG profile is bad, then you tend to hear about it pretty quickly from those companies, though. I think more.
That's what I was going to ask. I was going to say
inventory. Yeah, it's like their inventory assumptions aren't that right. It's like, okay, you might get one call, but if you say their emissions are twice as bad as their peers, then you get a pretty fast phone call from that.
You already answered mine. That was the follow-up question. I was like, I'm sure they're just taking it, whatever you give them on their ranking, and being like, they're not asking any questions at all. I'm sure they don't want to know how you guys came up with that.
Yeah. To be honest, they tend to be pretty constructive.
Okay.
It does tend to be fairly constructive conversations. It's like, hey, this is because it's, like ESG's been around for a while. Now
Right.
it's a lot more at the forefront of investors' minds. And like investors, like there's certain investors who are only investing off ESG. That what happens more commonly is like it's going to be a factor, right? It's like we want to understand a company's ESG profile. We want to understand, or like we'll understand the assets, things like that, and then we'll also want to understand ESG. And companies are the same way. Like they're, producers are like, hey, this is data that we might have been monitoring internally for a while, but we haven't really done a lot of external comparisons. So can you help us walk us through that comparisons? Like, where'd you get this data? Like, how can you make the call that we're, that our emissions are so much higher than peers, and that when we walk them through exactly what the data is saying and what the source of that data is, the reliability of it, then you can actually have a pretty constructive conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they want to know. Especially if there's, like we just mentioned in the previous segment, around compensation, and these things are being based on, and I'm sure they're probably hyper aware of these things, or starting to become. But pivoting to like the data, you guys are a big, your company does a lot of things. Is there I'm sure you're doing stuff. I don't know if you've made any acquisitions or if there's anything proprietary that you guys are doing to kind of access and house and mine this data, but just curious, anything you can share there around techniques or technology that you guys are utilizing, and what those types of data are. I don't know if you share anything, that you can't share, but I just am curious to see, it gets back to what we talked about earlier with you looking at oil and gas companies from the other side, from the type curves and all these other things, accounting data, like anything you can talk about on the data front.
Yeah. Like, might not get into all the specifics. I think it goes back to the philosophy of what we like. So to answer your question, it's all being built organically internally from our the ESG data that we're gathering. It kind of goes back to the philosophy that we've had, where you could get a good sense of what companies say their profile is by looking at disclosure. So most companies release sustainability reports, which are, pretty long, detailed documents of all the different initiatives they have. You get a lot of good information from that, but where we like to focus on is going to individual states. So when you talk about like air permits, or when you talk about like the Texas RRC, there's a lot of good information there. Different federal agencies too have different reporting requirements that you could pull in and get a sense of a company's overall positioning. But we're able to look at a pretty detailed view of companies' annual emissions profiles, of their well by well flared volumes. One thing that I think is emerging pretty quickly in this space is satellites too. So there's different satellites that that are taking like methane readings, which you got to be a little careful of, because when you're there's a lot of data, probably not manipulation is not the right word, but data cleansing that you need to do to get a true sense of where those methane emissions are coming from. But that technology is improving pretty rapidly, and I think that's a place that's interesting. Like, we use satellite imagery too, to try to see where these companies operate. There's a ton of things that are available to you, and it's really about trying to distill that down. Right, like with any of this stuff, like with oil and gas, you could get overloaded with information really quickly. You need to be able to figure out what's actually going to drive investor decisions, what's going to drive operators' decisions, and then so we take, I think we have something like 90 different data points or something like that we have on each company. We could add more, but we think that those are the ones that are important, and then we could distill that down to like an easy to understand narrative.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting for me because we do a lot of, like I said, midstream and marketing stuff, and we've got an advisory business that does consulting. We've got a energy marketing business, and we kicked around, everybody's trying to evolve, right? It's like, well, how do you do new things or in the ESG world? And what are things that you're currently doing today that you could maybe any business intelligence or things that you have. And one thing that we thought about that was really interesting is that we kind of have a lot of data around just the different way that people sell their product and the impact that that has. So, for example, if you're moving on a midstream system and that midstream system has a bunch of, older pipe that has high LNU, so lost and unaccounted for, or it's got, older compressors that are not, fully loaded and the field fuel is higher than a newer system that has compressors that are right size. And you may have 6% fuel over here and versus 10% fuel. If you've got a guy that's got his oil on truck, obviously there's trucking every barrel. That's not theirs, but that's a lot of trucks versus a guy that's got his oil on pipe. And so you start to look at all the data which we had internally for our clients and for the people that we worked with. Man, there's some kind of powerful data in here that we can look at and say, realistically, we could probably rank all the purchasers for our clients and say, here's your dirtiest purchaser based off of LNU, based off of field fuel, based off of these different things. I don't know how meaningful that would be. But I think that it's kind of like you start to uncover rocks. Like you mentioned, there's so much data in this industry. It's like you can look at a lot of things and glean kind of interesting conclusions about different impacts that different, company processes are having. So it's an interesting thing to me because at least from my world.
Yeah, no, yeah. Should take that conversation offline because it sounds like a lot of interesting stuff there. There's, right. And yeah, I think that's what we've seen is, when you start to look for this stuff, you could find some very interesting, pieces of data that are valuable. Right. And it's about using those tools to make a differentiated view.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close here. We're coming up on an hour. What is like going into the future? I mean, I know we've touched on a lot. I think the obvious thing is emissions. Is there anything else that, you see as trends that we haven't touched on that are kind of as things are evolving? I hate to put you on the spot because we're here on a podcast, but what did I not cover? I kind of answered a lot of the questions that I had, but I'm just curious about how this thing's going to evolve, quite frankly. That's what I think for me is the big question is how much of this is kind of flavor of the week, things that are big because, we just had an administration change and there's obviously a lot of focus in the media on this stuff. And then what is kind of the long lasting impacts of these things? Just any of your thoughts on, is this stuff going to just keep accelerating? Is it going to be, just any thoughts on the future and how this is going to evolve?
Yeah, 100%. Like, I think that, we're through, like the way to think about it is almost like an awareness stage. Like, I think that last year was a lot of investors were kind of turning their attention here and getting up to speed on what the market looks like. And I think that now what we're seeing things transition to is more of like an action phase. So it's like, it's like if I want to lower my emissions or whatever, like what tools do I have in my toolbox to accomplish those goals, whether that's, do I swap out some pneumatic devices, or is it, hey, do I start investing in CCS, or do I start trying to see the viability of like some CO2 flood or some EOR on operations on my land? And I think that we're starting to see different companies kind of branch out into that world. So I think that you're naturally going to see this play out over the next few years. It's going to be like we've already seen it on the flaring side. Like part of that is that gas production fell off from its 2019 highs, but it's pretty remarkable to see how much lower flaring rates are now in like the Permian and the Bakken and some of these other areas that have been known for a while to have really high rates of flaring. Like it's fallen off pretty dramatically in the last few years here. So I think that you're going to see those trends continue, and then I think that you're going to start to see a lot more on like the kind of the secondary side of things, which I think is on the CCS and EOR side of things, especially like, some of these, like there's still a ton of inventory. Don't get me wrong. But you are starting to see an increase in interest in EOR, so enhanced oil recovery. on operators' lands who, there's a ton of inventory. Not every operator has that luxury right now. And there's a lot of, attention going into that. And then if you could pair that with a reduction in emissions, then I think it's a win-win. The one that I like, this is more of like a personal thing that I've been trying to wrap my head around a little bit more, and I definitely am not an expert by any means, is because there's a few companies that are popping up that are taking a lot of oil and gas expertise and seeing if they could apply it to geothermal. That's something that, I think that's going to be an interesting trend to see play out too. And whether there's obviously a lot of overlapping expertise between hydrocarbon developments and drilling the right geothermal profile. I think that's a technology that's obviously still not at the commercial stage yet, but I think that you're getting a lot more attention, and people, a lot of really smart ex-oil and gas people who are turning their attention to there too. So I think like CCS and EOR could be an area of expansion, and then I wouldn't be surprised if 5 to 10 years down the road geothermal becomes more mainstream too.
Yeah. It's interesting about the flaring. You think it's really I feel like we're moving to a world where there's going to be a lot less flaring. It just seems like that could be something that's a relic of a period that where, you look back on it and it's like, oh, it's crazy they were flaring so much. But that seems like one that's going to happen. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there'll always be flaring, but.
Yeah, I think, but that's also a big win, right? If you could, if the industry could solve that, that's just a glaring, an easy thing to point to at the industry, right? You could look up a nightly satellite imagery of the U.S. a few years ago, and these plays are pretty bright, and that is going away pretty dramatically. And I think that'd be a big win for the industry. And also good for the midstream operators.
Yeah, for sure. Right? And then geothermal, go ahead.
I was going to say also good for the midstream operators who can move more gas.
Yeah, the midstream operators and the Bitcoin miners that are using it. I don't know if you've seen any of that, but these guys are putting it into those, and it's pretty interesting there too. I have a group on that talked about that, and it's very fascinating, just different ways. And it's ESG. That's, look, it's better to do it there. It's better to electrify it, right? There's actually an interesting case that's something that I've been trying to get more learn more about, is really just kind of this off-grid electrification. And I know, the obvious thing is the Bitcoin stuff, but some of this decentralized computing, it's like, why is, Amazon not putting their data centers in these shale plays and, just hooking it right up? You can basically, I think it's 60% cleaner to just electrify it. You lose all the loss and unaccounted for and fuel and line loss. And then you go through the processing plant, all the emissions that, and then you go and, you got to get it to pipeline quality, and then you got to get it into a power plant and a transmission line, and you take that same molecule of gas. And if you could electrify it and put it into an Amazon, data center or a Google data center, right there kind of in the field, that would be huge. I think broadband's not there yet, but if you could get access to the internet, in those sites, that's a really compelling, interesting thing for me, because I'm a natural gas guy really more than anything. And I'm like, let's find ways to use this, and clean. And it's also cleaner, I think. From what I've seen, I'm not an expert on how clean it is, but from the things I've seen, I think, off-grid electrification is quite a bit cleaner. So I'm wondering if any trends like that, it's kind of a more outside of the box one, but, if these companies were serious about finding alternatives, those things use a lot of power. Oh yeah. So I don't know. That's just a theme that I don't know if you ever looked into any of that, but it's interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think I'm all for it. That's one of the things I love about just working in the market is how creative some of these solutions are, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The Bitcoin, using natural gas in the field to mine Bitcoin, that was something that took me by surprise a few years ago when I first heard about it. But love the creativity.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if it's a better economic use case. If it's a way to make it more economically viable and it's cleaner. Exactly. That's always the win-win. Well, I'm excited to see how it's going to evolve. I'm glad that I could have you on and hear about it. And I think it's something that a lot of the listeners are probably going to want to hear this one, because I think a bunch of people have questions around, kind of what is ESG? If you really have to define it, because a lot of people have different definitions. How do we track it? What does it mean? And for somebody that's in it day in, day out, I think this was some really good insights for people. So I just want to say again, I appreciate you coming on, and And look forward to seeing if you put any research. Do you put notes out, or is it all just private, or do you ever put any notes out publicly or through the subscriptions that you guys do?
Yeah, so there's two components to our. Well, there's a few components, but the two of the main ones are either through our research or through our like data platform. So you can access all the data I talked about yourselves. If you subscribe, or you could also subscribe to our analyst research, and that's where we put out some of our forward-thinking thoughts on how some of these things are playing out. There's a lot more than just ESG there. Like we do a ton on just the overall anything oil and gas, really, anything on the service side to the asset side, to the macro side, to the valuation side, and now to the ESG side. We'll dig into that. But yeah, so there's a few ways to interact with us.
What's the best way to get a hold of it? Let's just go to the website. What's the best way to contact you guys for people that are interested?
Yeah, if anyone's interested, feel free to go to our website, Enverus.com. You could also, you could hit me up on email too. So nick.volkmer@enverus.com.
Awesome. Well, Nick, I appreciate it. Thanks again for coming on, and this has been a great talk. Thanks for making the show.
Yeah, I appreciate the time, Max. Thanks.